That Podcast Network and the It's Me Speaking to You podcast presents a podcast series for the archives. I talk to the producer and director of the Tupac Assassination series, as well as the latest groundbreaking docu-series, Tupac Cover-Up. RJ Bond comes and talks about his many years researching and reporting on this case. And we will go episode by episode, breaking it all down. It has been way too long, and there are still way too many unanswered questions. Buckle up. You do not want to miss this. All right, what's cracking, guys? We are back once again for another installment of the Tupac Cover-Up breakdown. We are going into episode 4 here in this glorious weekend, this Friday, this year of our Lord 2024. Got my man RJ Bond riding shotgun. How you doing, RJ?
What's up, guys? How's everybody doing?
We, like I said, we took a little bit of a break. Circumstances beyond our control. We had the holiday, and then you did a little business over in the Large Apple, man. What you had going on over there?
Yeah, we had a press screening for the Tupac Cover-Up docu-series. It was actually a very special cut of it. It was a 2.5 hour cut of the docu-series and kind of made it kind of a best of reel. But we took all the things that we thought were the best highlights from the show, put it into a special 2 hour format, which will never ever see the light of day other than that one event. And we then went ahead and had the press there. I mean, we had great coverage. We had James Desborough from the Sun, UK Sun. We had the Times, CBS News was there. We had a lot of good coverage, and you'll see over the next several weeks, as these things tend to trickle out when people write articles about stuff, that they got great feedback. One of the best parts, as far as I was concerned, from doing a show like this. I mean, when you do it, it's funny when you do a movie, and it's out at the theater, then you could go there and watch the movie with a crowd of people. When you do a DVD or a streaming series, you get a few people that watch it with you, and your distributor watches it with you, and everybody says, okay, this is great. But you really never know how people are going to react to or how they respond to what you've done in your show. The press screening, I think we had maybe 150 people there. The press screening was great because whenever there was a mic drop moment in the show, you could audibly hear audience members either laugh or gasp or make a comment like, "Oh, hell no," somebody said. The audience was very, very good feedback from the audience talking to the screen. But it was like that. Our unintentional comic relief, Reggie Wright Jr. was dropped a few bangers on the crowd, and we got some of that, but largely he got a lot of laughs because I think people understood, what's really going on behind the scenes there. So we had that, but like I said, one of the best things was that, and then the other thing was that the attorney for the family showed up at the screening.
For the Tupac family, of course.
For the Tupac family, that's correct. And the cool thing about that was that this is not the Tupac estate. And you got to kind of differentiate the two for all those playing at home. The Tupac estate controls the rights to his music and the rights to his likeness and image and T-shirts and the merchandise and all that. And the estate pays the family, or is supposed to pay the family, royalties that come from the management of all of that. And there's some controversy. Sejua Shakur, who was Tupac's sister, is actually in the middle of a lawsuit against the estate, and that's why I've mentioned them as two different entities, because she is suing the estate, saying that Tom Wally, who is the man who manages the estate, is paying himself more than $1 million a year to manage the estate, but somehow the rest of the money isn't quite getting to the family. So she's called for an audit, and there's a whole lot thing going on there with it. And the reason I say all that is because as the newspapers have said, the family has hired Alex Spiros is the name of the attorney, and he was the attorney that recently represented Alec Baldwin in the wrongful death suit or
Mm.
wrongful death. It wasn't a lawsuit, the wrongful death criminal case against Alec Baldwin as to whether or not he was going to be guilty of, negligent homicide, which is something we talk about in the documentary, amazingly enough.
Yeah.
But the Alex Spiros, who represented him and actually got him exposing the prosecutors for some malfeasance on the prosecution side, got him a mistrial. He was hired by the family to investigate the Las Vegas case, investigate the Dwayne Davis narrative, and to investigate any other alternative theories or what might actually have happened to Tupac in Las Vegas in September of 1996. So they did retain this high profile, very high profile New York attorney to investigate this. And I met it with a lot of skepticism. I was like, well, are they, is this really serious? Is this a publicity stunt? How much more can a private attorney do 30 years after the fact that the police can't do? I was
Right.
kind of dubious on the whole thing. But the main attorney that's working for Alex Spiros came to the screening, to the press screening, and he called first, and we, of course, said, sure, why not? He came to the screening and was very supportive of the documentary, and relayed back to the family that there's a lot of traction where this documentary really shines, and so we're encouraged to be working. I won't say with them, but certainly providing them information that backs up a
Right.
lot of our claims, so that they can make a good analysis. And we said we'd be happy to help them out, and we're going to work with them in that to that regard. So that was a pretty big thing when you get the
Yeah.
the family, and the attorneys are conveying to the family that having seen the movie, because they did, he came and saw it, that he liked it and thought that it was good traction for the investigation they're doing. So it always helps when you have uh, results that you get from doing your work. It's a good validation there all the way around.
For sure. I mean, that's definitely some good direct feedback from somebody so intimately involved. I was anxious to hear because I heard about the family hiring that attorney, and I thought it was interesting too. The timing, obviously, with Keith Davis being arrested, et cetera. Some 30 years later, the family hires an attorney. So I'll be anxious to see what they glean from, like you said, what are they going to find that these investigators haven't found for the last 30 years. So it should be very interesting. And you also had some other notable attendees to the screening, if you don't mind breaking some of that off.
Oh, I mean, from the show,
At the screening.
yeah. Well, I mean, obviously we had some, Keefe D. Jr. was at the screening, and sat on a panel. We did a Q&A after the screening was over. We did a Q&A for the press. Keith Davis Jr. was there. He weighed in on the subject matter of the show. Um, Phil Carson was there. We were glad to have Phil. He was there and was able to give a little bit more detail on some of the allegations that were in the movie, to the press, because obviously, they come out of these things and they have questions. So,
And
we
just for
got.
people playing catch up ball a little bit, Phil Carson and his role in all of this.
Oh, Phil Carson was the lead FBI investigator for the Biggie and the Tupac and the LAPD malfeasance cases for the FBI.
Mm. Yeah, man. I would love to have been a fly on the wall. When you started, hearing what were a lot of the questions that you were getting? Was there kind of a theme or was it a little bit of all over the place? Did you find a certain consistency in what was being asked of you guys?
Well, as is kind of typical in a lot of press conferences, different news agencies kind of have their own angle, because they're kind of, even when they're watching the movie, they're kind of writing the story in their own heads. I learned this back in 2007 when we did our first press screening, that each reporter has their own story that they're thinking of that they're going to write. So when it comes time for the Q&A, they're going to ask you questions kind of all over the map, because each one of them is looking to get an answer to a question that is going to kind of satisfy what their article is going to be about. And no
Right.
two of them are going to write the same article. So you do get a variety of different kind of questions. What we found, and was really good, it was good for us, that most of the media were very supportive of the show, very supportive of the work that we're doing. We're glad that facts were coming out now, and were very supportive of our position that said, we need to let the legal system work its way out, but if you're stacking the deck,
Right.
that's not good either. So, there's a lot of that going on in our legal communities these days,
For sure.
criminally and otherwise. Look at everything's happening down in Fulton County. It's crazy. So we definitely were happy that the press were so interested and picked up on what we were doing. So looking forward to a lot of good articles coming out. Um, some of the press may be waiting. We've talked about doing another press screening in February on the West Coast, so we'll see if that happens. But yeah, it's kept me wrapped up because it's not just the screening and editing for the screening, cutting a 2 hour version of the movie, but then after the screening's over, then I do all the follow-up interviews that the press wants you to do. They don't all do them just that
Right.
night. You're weeks later. When you got 150 people there, you're weeks later doing interviews for these things. So I apologize for not being back with you sooner,
No, that's all right,
but
man.
we're
That's all
back
right.
now, and you actually want to talk about my favorite episode of the show. I have different ones that I like for different reasons, but I think overall my favorite is episode 4. Some would say it's the slower of the episodes, but I like it because it's got sentimental value to me.
Absolutely. Well, and
But
as we ended obviously episode 3, the chaos ensued. Tupac's dead. They are continuing to push the narrative of Orlando to some degree. LAPD is officially running interference for cops that are working with Death Row, and the continuing again, doubling down on the Orlando narrative. And of course, we have Reggie at the end saying, "You don't really know me. You don't know what I'm capable of doing or not doing," and saying he is, just kind of showing his little bit of a darker side, just saying, kind of that look in his eyes, kind of a shady look. But that is how episode 3 ends, and we get into episode 4, good cop, bad cop. And I actually, having watched this series multiple times now, in this particular episode, it really resonates with me because for me, it really puts a lot of light and shine on one of the heroes of not just this story, but the Biggie story. And we need more of these kind of human beings, and that is Russell Poole. I came across him when I first watched the Nick Broomfield Biggie and Tupac documentary in 2002, and just any movie, Serpico or whatever, where especially cops, man, where they're tasked with upholding the law, enforcing the law, and then they find out some of maybe their compadres are involved in some shady stuff and try to shine light on that. When they get shut down, oftentimes, their careers are ended, their lives are turned upside down, and even their lives are ended because it's their information, their news is a threat to some of these power structures, and that's honestly what seemed to happen to Russ Poole in this episode of Good Cop, Bad Cop. We're starting out episode 4, Frank Alexander being told by Michael Moore to get out of Las Vegas. And we'll talk about that. Why is Michael Moore saying Frank needs to get out of Las Vegas?
well, in Frank's book, Before I Wake, I'm sorry, Got Your Back. And then later, I think in the movie Before I Wake, he may have repeated it, but definitely in Got Your Back. There was a point in time, the day that Tupac actually died, Frank and a bunch of the crew, the security crew and others, had gathered at Suge Knight's house in Vegas. And when he died, they were all sitting outside by the pool, and Suge Knight got the call, picked up the phone and got the call and the announcement that Tupac had died. According to Frank in his book, Suge ripped the phone out of the wall and threw it across the yard into the pool because he was that upset. And Reggie leaned over to Frank and told Frank, "You need to get out of here. Get out of here right now. Leave." And the implication there was, clearly, I don't know that Suge would have done it, but the perception was Frank didn't do his job. So, or that he allowed this to happen, which is ludicrous. But I think the more compelling thought behind it now, understanding the kind of person that Reggie Wright is, later, I think if we look back at that story, the reason he was telling Frank to get out of there was because he knew that he was planning on throwing Frank under the bus.
Right.
And so he told Frank to get out of there. He didn't want Frank to hear it because Frank was never the kind of guy to back down from a confrontation. If somebody told Frank, "Hey, you said this XYZ, boo, boo, boo," he would come back. He wouldn't, say, "Well, I don't want to talk about that," or "no comment." He would comment on it and he'd get right in your face about it and would have the conversation. So there was clearly none of that. So again, with with all of Suge's homeboys around there and everybody upset and everybody mad and looking for somebody to blame, um, the fact that Frank would get blamed, thrown under the bus, would also mean that those guys that were the gangster guys would carrying guns. They
Right.
may have they tried to take their frustrations out on him. So, whether or not it was self-motivated that Reggie was going to throw Frank under the bus, telling him to get out was probably a good idea. So Frank went to a hotel and stayed for a hotel for a couple of days.
Well, and
Be-
there was some indication, like as you said, Frank gets that call to get out of there, and within days, a day or two, he gets a call. Frank gets a call from Suge saying, "Hey, we're all going to go out to Lake Mead and go
yeah,
jet skiing and stuff." And
yeah.
of course, Frank's speculating and hypothesizing on what that could have ended up as, but potentially he was speculating that that could have been a potential disappearance trip.
Well, Lake Mead is very deep, or at least it was
Right.
even back in those days. It's kind of shallower now, but it was still very deep. And for many, many, many years, the Las Vegas Review Journal and other papers that I talked to said that that was a dumping ground for the mob. The Lake Mead was where you took the bodies and threw the bodies, and if they ever drained Lake Mead, it would be a sight for people to see. And so Frank, and I think Frank already knew that. So, it was one of those situations where I don't think so would have been the appropriate
I mean, I'm not,
response.
yeah, and especially, and I'm not really, my boy just died. I'm not really in the mood to jet ski right now. I mean, the
Right. Yeah.
timing of that request is like, yeah, it's not really time to go hanging out
Yeah.
and
Well,
kicking it.
I try to give that a little bit of levity, because if people grieve in different ways,
It's
and
true.
and, and
Very true.
if getting people's minds out of the terrible thing that happened, that at that time with the shooting and all that, and get rid of that loss, diverting people's attention away or doing something to try to kind of boost everybody's morale. I mean, that's not a bad thing. I mean, I did a lot of soul searching about that, and I think in and of itself it sounds like it's a good thing to do. It sounds very altruistic. Let's get everybody's minds off of this and
Right.
let's go do that. But on the other side of it, like I said, it could have been a very bad situation, and I think Frank picked up on that very wisely.
Well, and you're correct. Everyone does grieve differently. I just, can if someone's calling me saying, "Hey, get out of Las Vegas," and then my other boss calls me and is like, "Hey, let's go hang
Hey,
out in
by the
this
way,
remote
yeah,
area."
yeah, you still around? Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
again, this is good cop, bad cop, and then enter the hero of these stories, Russell Poole, as Reggie's trying to spin his web and trying to take everyone down the Orlando lane. No pun intended. Russell's just not having it. Russell's digging deeper and realizing there was way way more to this, and someone who kind of and again, you don't get to the head of robbery homicide in Los Angeles being some gumshoe cop who doesn't know what he's doing. As Don Sikorsky says, if you don't do that unless you have your shit together. And certain individuals who gave that stamp for Russell Poole was somebody like Sergio Robledo. And again, Don Sikorsky's talked so glowingly of him. And, he was vouching for Russell Poole. Talk to me a little bit about Sergio Robledo's role in kind of giving that stamp of authenticity to Russell Poole, who they say was like a cop's cop, a good cop.
Well, Sergio was Russell's boss when he worked down South Bureau Homicide, and that's where everybody kind of gets their start before you go to LAPD's kind of elite robbery homicide division in downtown LA. You work the local. It's almost like the farm team. You work the local robbery homicide division. Every division of the LAPD has a robbery homicide team, and that could be 10 cops, that could be 23 cops. I mean, it could be 50 cops depending on the size of the division. And so those cops work, and then based on the work that you do and the job and your commitment to doing it, when you get that, you get called up to the majors, continuing that analogy, and you get brought up to robbery homicide downtown. And that's certainly where Russ went. One of Russell's, observations right away was that you weren't really being called up to the majors. You were kind of being put out to pasture because the robbery homicide guys, according to Russ, were more concerned about their tea times at the golf club and the country club than they were about solving homicides. And so, and maybe that's deserved, but for people that hit a certain level of success, I don't know. But Russ wasn't happy with it because Russ was a true a true detective. He was a one that if somebody got killed, Russ was going to find out who did it. And that's just kind of an art that's fleeting, because you see more of the type of investigator of a Greg Kading, and I'll
Right.
say this: the difference between the two investigators, Greg Kading and Russell Poole, because this episode is really a contrast.
Yeah.
Um, we didn't say it in these words, but essentially, what I've always believed to be the difference between a Greg Kading and a Russell Poole is that Russell Poole came into a situation and did what a detective's supposed to do. You let the leads take you where they might. If you, especially since you don't know anything, you don't know what you don't know, and so you're going to take a lead and you're going to call and you're going to follow up on it as much as you can, to follow that lead to the end. And then the other thing is that, um, you don't know what the picture is going to be. It could be this, it could be that. You could be wrong. You could go down the wrong lane. By contrast, from all available evidence and all available information and his book and all that, we make the point that Greg Kading's investigation appears to be making a picture fit the frame.
Right.
And it says in his book, within not even 2 months, and I think we mentioned in the movie, not even, 2 months after Kading and his buddies take over this investigation, they're immediately right back at the Orlando Anderson narrative. It's like, well, wait a minute, how did that happen? You just, but that's lazy police work. You just go with what everybody else has said was the thing, and he was listening to the wrong people, et cetera. But my whole view of Kading was that Kading didn't let the leads, and he kind of says it in his book. Oh, are you gonna let us go where the leads will take us, regardless of who's? Yeah, yeah, sure we will. Well, strangely enough, they ended up back where they were originally, and nothing new was investigated. So, and in fact, other leads, as we know, because we talked about Blatchford and the confession letter and all that, other leads were actually torched by Kading and his team. So not only were they, the best word I could use is confirmation bias. They
Right.
already had something in their head that they wanted to put out. Question is why? And we learned later with KVD why. But they had a narrative that they wanted to push out, and not only were they going to support that narrative and only that narrative, but they were going to actively campaign to discredit any other narratives that were introduced, that
And
might
Kading has
be.
been explicit in saying, Randall Sullivan, who's the author of the book Labyrinth, which was based off Russell Poole's investigation, saying both of those were false. The book was false, the premise of the book was false, and obviously Russell Poole was false. A quick clarification for my timeline. Russell wasn't involved in any way in the Pac assassination investigation because obviously that was a Las Vegas crime. He entered into all of this with the Kevin Gaines Frank Liga shooting a week after Biggie died. Is that when Russell kind of got involved in all of this?
Right. Russell's first assignment was the Kevin Gaines, Frank Liga shooting incident,
Okay.
and he started investigating that, and of course that opened the door because of Gaines' relationship with Suge Knight, Death Row's founder. His wife Sharitha Knight was dating Kevin Gaines at that time. They'd had a 4-year relationship, and that opened up the whole Death Row Records side of things and Kevin Gaines' relationship with Death Row Records, and um, the other things that Death Row Records was involved with, and of course that led to the Biggie killing because it was all related. And
Right.
again, like you said, he's just following. He wasn't even following Biggie. He wasn't even assigned for Biggie. He just happened to notice, kind of like Phil Carson did, that there's some things that are in this and commonalities in this that share DNA with this other crime that may have happened, and he went to where the leads would take him. He didn't determine this is I have this idea about what happened. Russ Poole never said corrupt cops who work for LAPD killed Biggie. I mean he said that years later, but he didn't start off that way. Nobody does. I mean he wouldn't have known.
Right.
And so we're talking about again letting the leads lead you in a certain direction, not being presumptive. And of course, all you see in the later investigation is nothing but presumptions. And but that's when you ask the question, well, why? Why didn't Kading consider other things? He'll tell you he did. There's no proof of that. And in fact, how do you arrive at the conclusion that this one theory is the only theory that counts after a couple of months? How
And how
you
much do you think? How much do you think that he was a trying to get his own bag with his book and the documentary and the docu series? How much of that was he doing just that for his own self gain, or how much was he trying to protect the LAPD from this potentially almost $1 billion lawsuit that Valletta Wallace had?
Right. Well, I'm going to defer that answer to that question because and this will be an announce, I guess, I'll drop for you. We are currently in production on season 2 of Tupac Cover Up, and one of the questions that we are addressing head on is not only why Keith Davis, why the investigation, but what role LAPD may have had in all of it.
Hmm.
So we're gonna dive deep into season 2 about it and kind of pick up on some threads that we left in the first season, and that's certainly going to be one of them, the one thing that we're answering. So I don't want to spoil it
I
because
got you. Heck yeah.
we're working
Looking
on
forward to it.
and that's the hard part about doing all this stuff is I'm working on some really cool stuff, and I'd like nothing better than to share all of it. But then again, like tip the tip the crowd, and suddenly we learn that. But yeah, stay tuned.
In due time. In due
Yeah, stay
time.
tuned. Yeah, we're rushing to get it out because like I said, there's been a lot of developments and a lot of information that's are still pouring out. And the biggest thing and to make mention is that we are back on Tubi again.
Yes.
That was a big get for us. Right after the day after the press screening, we got word from our distributor that Tubi had decided that my argument back to them that I had made was very compelling as to why they should put it back up with no changes. There were no editorial
Nice.
changes. And then I didn't have to cut a frame of it. They put it back up there again. And of course, I will say, sadly, that the entities that tried to get it down the first time tried again to try to get it down the second
Hmm.
time. And this time, though, because of the traction that the show is getting, and clearly, we dotted our I's and crossed our T's, and there's no there, and to be, to their wisdom and profit, elected to let it stay up there. So that's been great, and we're getting incredible word of mouth right now, incredible traction on the show, the likes of which I totally didn't expect. So we're very happy about that.
Well, it's a great series. Tubi and Zumo, XUMO.com. You can check it out.
Yep, it's on
Congrats
Roku
on that.
too. It's
And
on
on
Roku.
Roku.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah.
A little bit of everywhere. And we
Yep.
can't get too deep into this introduction of Russell Poole because early in this episode, we also meet his lovely wife, his widow now, Megan Poole. Talk to me a little bit about Megan. And it was interesting how they were, she's talking about, we just hung out all the time. We were best friends. And then, she was hanging out with a guy she thought she might have liked. And then Russell came to the same bar or whatever with, like, look, kind of fired his shot. And,
Sure.
the rest is history. But she seemed like a lovely, lovely lady. Talk to me a little bit about Megan Poole.
Well, I've been personal friends with Megan now for I can't believe it's been 10 years, but just about 10 years. And I'm just not a day that goes by that I don't appreciate her. She is very salt of the earth. She's as grounded as Russ was in terms of just day to day. She's a very pragmatic person, very, she's an optimist, but she's also very pragmatic about things. Like, do you really think it's going to go that way or not? So, and I guess you couldn't be with a detective like Russ, and not adopt that or not have that personality of your own. And that's what attracts people to people is, she's every bit as strong-willed as Russell was. And that's good and bad sometimes in a marriage, right? But in terms of her involvement, Russ has just been beat up in the media, and our unfortunately our society is kind of like the last word in is the final word, and you get these people like your Greg Kadings, like your Reggie Wrights. You get these people that want to not appreciate Russ Poole for the work that he did, even though you can find a video on Vlad where Reggie Wright says that Russ Poole was right. Okay, you have to go look for that one. But when you take shots at a guy like Russ, I mean, it affects his family, it affects all this kind of stuff. And then, Kading did that show Unsolved, which I think is a perfect perfect name for a show involving a guy who couldn't solve a crime. Called it Unsolved. Yep, that's right. That's how he left it, and that's how it's going to stay. But they portrayed Russ. Simpson played Russ. They portrayed him as a neurotic guy, an obsessive guy, a guy that had a storage facility that had cork boards with pins in it, with and yarn and all this craziness and this obsession that they thought that Russ Poole had, and to some degree, even City of Lies did that. With all deference to Don and his team. Russ's later years, in my opinion, were not an accurate reflection because I was with him. I mean, we was Russ and his wife stayed at my house, so they shared a house with us. So I kind of know the guy waking up on a Sunday morning to go get some breakfast, kind of thing. When you develop that kind of relationship with people, you understand who they are and you understand what their lives are like. And it just, not only was it not that to begin with, but it wasn't that in his later years. He wasn't obsessive like that. And in fact, I watched Russ Poole turn down more interviews than any interviews that he accepted. He'd have news people calling him all the time for different reasons and wanting to do interviews with him. And it's too far to drive. And I
Hmm.
don't want to go all the way down there. It's LA. I don't want to bother with LA. And he would it was literally like that. He shot down interviews all the time. And not only that, but he was just, his day-to-day stuff was the baseball, the sports. He was hiking more. He just wasn't fixated on the Biggie and Tupac thing. He got more that way. I don't know, good or bad. He got more that way when I got involved with him, and I started saying, "Hey, let's put our heads together and let's start working on this side of things." I knew the Tupac stuff, he knew the Biggie stuff, and some of the Tupac stuff, but a lot of what I was bringing into the picture with the assassination movies, Russ picked up on. And that's why we agreed to do the book together. But when you work that closely with somebody like I did, him. I mean, there's other people that work closely with him, helped him write a book, Carlin and some other people. But I mean, the guy lived with me, so you kind of know both him and Megan very well when you get
Right.
that intimate of a relationship. And Kurt Poole, amazing guy. Doug, all of them. His kids are great kids. They weathered all of this very well, and they're still staunch supporters of their dad. Um, you know, when Megan agreed to do the interview, I thought it was appropriate because nobody really had spoken up for Russ, not really, and so that's why in this documentary I felt like it was important to acknowledge whether or not you agreed with Russ, whether or not you believed he was on the right path or didn't believe he was on the right path. Russell never stopped caring about it. Russell never stopped caring about those who'd been killed. And so I wanted to say this guy died with his boots on, and that was the Russ Poole segment, I think, in a nutshell. And Megan was so great about dispelling a lot of the bad information that was put out there by Greg Kading in that unsolved travesty, and even some of the stuff in City of Lies.
And I think that is hugely important. I mean, I guess, we see all the time if you can't control somebody, then you have to control how people perceive you.
Yep.
And, this kind of mischaracterization. I mean, the guy, I mean, I don't know him, but just seeing what I've seen of him, and especially like people like Sergio Robledo, and just seeing his wife, and he was just a good guy, good cop, good investigator, good father, just a regular person. That's why it just really, honestly, just really pisses me off. Truly, what they did to him.
Mhm.
I mean, he was a great cop up until he wasn't. And I
Right.
mean, just listening to how Megan was kind of explaining his frustration, you can just kind of feel it when he's hitting this wall. He's able
Yeah.
to investigate any other crime, and he's the man. And but he starts getting into this case, and he starts seeing he wasn't able to investigate certain individuals. David Mack, Ralphio Perez, and even Robledo was saying he started realizing he became the focus of the police's ire as he's investigating these crimes. I think Kurt Poole mentioned in this episode his 40-page report when he sent it in got, edited down to 2 pages,
Yeah.
just trying
Yeah.
to like limit his investigation. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Well, it's just kill the messenger. I mean, that's the
Right.
best way to sum it up is kill the messenger. The Russ went into areas and started uncovering areas that the LAPD wasn't comfortable with. I mean, they clearly later acknowledged them, but at the time, whether or not they knew these relationships and this corruption that was in the LAPD took a lot of people by surprise. And and just like, wow, that's really happening under our own noses. And you've got a lot of senior management in the LAPD supervisory roles asleep at the wheel. I mean, how does that happen? Unless you're going to say that it was corrupt all the way up to the top, which I'm not. But if you did and said that, then you have to say they were clearly asleep at the wheel while all of this corruption was happening, underneath their noses. And so nobody, and just from a hubris standpoint, nobody wants to be told that. Nobody wants to say, "Hey, you
Right.
were asleep. What happened to you? You finally wake up." So that was the best case scenario. Worst case scenario was you had a lot of real bad apples up in the supervisory division, and we're condoning this behavior. We're condoning the gang relationships with the cops. And there's one or two good reasons for that. The first off is that either, when the LAPD relaxed their hiring standards in the 90s, they never used to allow a police officer that had gang affiliations to be part of the police department. And under Bernard Parks, they removed that restriction. And so you could be gang affiliated and grow up in a gang neighborhood. And they, would say, well, that doesn't make you a bad guy. You can grow up in a gang neighborhood. Doesn't mean you're a gangster. Doesn't mean you're a bad guy. Come to find out, a lot of guys were. So,
Right.
they kind of missed that one. But in terms of that was the first thing is that they allowed the guys with the gang affiliations and belonging to gangs. That was a big change for the LAPD.
Well, and I don't know how much he was affiliated with gangs. I know he grew up in that area, but David Mack personally, like you said, you want to hesitate as far as how high it went, and I have no direct evidence, but literally, Chief Bernard Parks brought in specifically recruited David Mack, who wound up being involved in all this Rampart stuff. He recruited him himself, and apparently from somebody who in this episode said they had other personal relations outside of the department. So it's like either he was just incompetent and just like, oops, I did it again, or he was had to have been fairly well aware of some of these individuals he knew directly were involved in some of this nefarious business.
Well, you'd like to think that he's on top of his business, that he's managing his business and the employees. But I think one of the things that the Rampart scandal, if you will, and the consent decree that the LAPD had to find, and for those at home, a consent decree is when a court gives you the opportunity to um, determine how you're going to make changes that are going to um, make your department better, and then the judge approves that. That's why it's called consent. You have consent of the judge, and it's a decree that this is how we're going to change things. We're going to make things different. And I think that the research leading up to the consent decree really showed that there were a lot of people asleep at the wheel. That it wasn't just a passive acceptance of, oh, these guys are, gangsters. I mean, the crash unit was dissolved and then they resurrected the crash units, and those are the gang units in the LAPD. And really, when they localized the gang units, that was another problem for the LAPD because now, and we talked about this, I think, in the last episode, we talked about what community policing was
Mm.
and how when you police a community, you're embedded within the people that you do day-to-day life with. And in a perfect world, a police officer might patrol a street and he actually lives a couple of blocks away. That's community policing because that allows you to better interact with the people that you know and make a difference and be part of a civic body. In these particular cases, though, the it kind of works against you if your community affiliation is gangs and you're working in a gang neighborhood and you happen to also be a member of the gang unit. Okay, and that was the same. I don't want to call it a disease, but it was kind of the same disease, for lack of a better term, that affected Tim Brennan and Bobby Ladd of the Compton Police Department that were the gang cops there. They were gang cops in a gang town. How removed can you be from any malfeasance or um, you know um, any kind of work that would be not copacetic as far as what police officers would be expected to do. So you have that. But with the community policing standpoint, when the LAPD began to centralize local to each division, they would have a division crash unit, and it was really watered down because the original crash unit for LAPD was kind of like robbery homicide. It was kind of an elite centralized team that only the best of the best. I remember, you might if you're old enough to remember the old TV show SWAT, the 1970s, TV show. But, at one point SWAT was an elite unit. There wasn't SWAT in every police department that you ever saw, five-guy police department. They have a SWAT team, small town
Special
America.
weapons and tactics. Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a very
Uh,
specialized unit.
yes. And they were centralized, kind of like Crash was centralized. They were a very centralized, very mission specific team with experts on it. These were the guys. But LAPD went and then they said, well, they dissolved that and delegated it down to the divisions. And now you've got guys that aren't necessarily specialists. They may be specialists for that division and not taking anything away from any of the cops that are really good at what they do. But they really um, kind of watered down the crash model, made it localized. But now you have gang cops and crash units and heavy artillery being used in the community. It's not being flown in an extreme situation. It's now an everyday use of force example. And we,
Right.
we see this with the FBI even. They're kind of doing it now. They show up at somebody's house to serve a search warrant and they got 15 guys in body armor showing up with tanks. You know, look at
Yeah.
the Keefe D. When they did, they called him when they search warrant on his house. Vegas shows up with friggin' tanks.
The
Okay,
militarization of the
yeah,
police
what the
department
hell
for
were they
sure.
thinking?
Yeah.
Okay, well, they're showing up at Keefe D's house with tanks. They haven't talked to this guy in 10 years, and they suddenly show up to a search warrant, and then it's a big show. So again, but I think that the failures of the LAPD in their what I think was good ideas just not done right. That's what allowed them after the Rampart thing to do the consent decree, and hopefully they made some changes for the better. But that's why the kind of the inner mechanics of why all that happened.
Mm.
And I'm doing that because we're actually going to cover that in season 2 of the show.
Very interesting. Well, and again, some of the stuff that Russell was catching wind of.
Yep.
This is FBI Field Report 194 CLA 232722, March 13th, 1995. And this is what Russell's catching wind about as far as LAPD being ensconced in death row security. There was a rival gang member beaten to death at the El Rey Theater while these individuals, police officers who were working security, either participated or just stood by while this happened. And even that wasn't necessarily investigated properly. Talk to me about that deal at the El Rey Theater. What was that about?
Well, I don't want to get too deep in the El Rey Theater. That's ancient history.
Okay.
And again, we because we talked for an hour about that all by itself, but really, you hit the nail on the head. When starting at that event and then subsequent events, the realization that you had drug trafficking felons hanging out in the same hallway as LAPD officers, and it was Inglewood officers, it was Hawthorne officers, a lot of different police departments that had paid security working for death row records. You've got this kind of unholy alliance going on between those two people, or those two groups, I should say. And so when you have that and you have the LAPD there, of course, yeah, of course there's going to be red flags up about it. LAPD, anytime you did overtime, LAPD was supposed to request from their supervisors the ability to go work, and they'd had to be cleared for what they were doing as far as extracurricular activities when they weren't on duty. And that didn't happen. A lot of them just went and did it without asking. And the one guy that did, Rich McCauley, the one guy that actually did ask for it, he was turned down, and he turned around and he did it anyway. So
Wow.
that's really the kind of culture that you get, I think, when you start hanging out with drug dealers, felons. Suge Knight was being investigated for arms trafficking at the time. There was an FBI investigation for RICO happening at that time. There was just so much going on in terms of every federal agency on the planet was looking at death of records,
Right.
and yet that's like it's like toxic. It's like radioactive. And why the hell all these cops would be thinking that that's the place that they want to go? Kind of baffles your mind when you think about it. Other than it's exciting and
Yeah.
whatever other things that it's.
Yeah. It's a definitely adventure. I mean, it's not. I mean, the Fed's hands are like so everywhere, in not just this crime, but just in this environment. You know, when you start talking about death row being investigated for arms trafficking, Kevin Hackey was undercover FBI and undercover ATF investigating, like you said, the RICO, the drug trafficking, the arms trafficking. Um, and as Russ keeps pushing, man, and keeps pushing, he's starting to get pushback from not just his contemporaries, but like his partners and stuff. Steve Strong is telling Russ, man, pump the brakes, don't push too hard because who
You
knows
have
where
to be
this can.
sensitive to the politics of the situation. And one thing I could say
Yes,
about
very sensitive.
Russ was like the least political person, the least politically correct person on the planet. He had a heart of gold, but he comes from a time when if you had something on your mind and you wanted to say it, you said it, and you really didn't care about how you couched it. I think what's interesting to me is that with the whole politically correct pronouns and everything like that, a guy like Russ would have a really difficult time, and because it didn't get better after that. We
Right.
become more restrictive on what we say and how we express ourselves and how
Of
we couch
course.
things, and Russ wasn't that way. Russ just didn't feel like there was enough time in the day to be pussyfooting around how you felt about something because there was work to be done. A dead guy was there, and we needed to find out who did it. And time is short, and so you just when they say the first 48 hours are the most crucial, and so you just don't have a lot of time for small talk and a lot of time for that. So,
I can only imagine that adds to his frustration when he's trying to be the cop's cop. He's investigating these murders,
yeah,
these homicides, and these crimes, and he's realizing that he has involvement from his own people creating this resistance. And I can only imagine when he started realizing, like I said earlier, he was getting resistance to investigating people like David Mack, Rafael Perez, but he realized through his Kevin Gaines death investigation that there was a bunch of cocaine that Rafael Perez stole from the locker from a Frank Liga drug investigation. That had to have been absolutely mind blowing. Not only these guys working, these cops working for death row, they're stealing coke from the freaking locker room.
yeah, there was a lot of things there, and I'm trying to keep our narrative somewhat linear here. But yeah, I mean, and Russ wasn't the guy that found out about the drugs, about the Frank Liga thing. That happened later. Rafael Perez taking the drugs from Frank Liga happened somewhat later.
Oh,
Uh,
my bad. I'm messing up my
yeah, that's okay.
timeline.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it's all right. No, listen, trust me. It's like a six-headed hydra. Just keeping everything straight is a pain in the butt. So, no, you're right in the fact that Rafael Perez was busted for stealing drugs and specifically Frank Laga. And it was because, according to Perez and according to Ken Bogney, who was a cellmate of Perez's, who claimed that Perez told him, a lot of things, that it was payback against Liga for the Gaines shooting. That Perez was trying to get Liga in trouble because Liga killed Kevin Gaines. Now, the interesting thing about that angle is that you have to ask yourself about Rafael Perez. Well, why did he care? I mean, we don't have a lot of direct information that they were best of friends. So, or that they had any previous relationship at all. There's no relationship between
That's what I
Rafael
wondered.
Perez
Yeah.
and Kevin Gaines.
Yeah.
So, for Perez to make a move on that drug buy against Frank Liga because Kevin Gaines got killed, what does Rafael Perez care that Kevin
Well, and
Gaines?
how would that get Liga in trouble from him stealing his stuff from the locker? I don't
Well,
get how that.
because it would either be seen as that Liga was reporting more drugs had been confiscated than there were, or when evidence starts disappearing and it's his case, he's responsible for that.
Okay.
So it
Yeah.
would
Yeah. That
look
makes
bad on
sense.
him because up until and this actually plays into the Snoop Dogg murder charge and him getting dismissed from a murder case because evidence disappeared out of the Pacific Division evidence locker. Any evidence of that would have been used to prosecute Snoop suddenly disappeared out of that same evidence locker in Pacific Division. I guess they had a revolving door on the front of the evidence room there,
Right.
but
Right.
yeah, with an easy opening, automatic opening doors. And but when that happened and that stuff, many people think that Kevin Gaines was directly behind that. He was stationed at the Pacific Division during that time when that evidence disappeared. But they clearly felt it was, and I think Perez and Gaines both worked Pacific Division, so I know that they knew each other, but not like that, where Perez is going to put himself in potential crosshairs to start screwing with another cop, being Frank Liga, over some revenge motive against a guy that he didn't even really know. So it
Right.
makes you kind of question maybe who was behind. Maybe there was somebody else kind of asking Ray Perez to get into to do this against this Liga guy because maybe, and you have to look at who was hurt by Kevin Gaines' disappearance. Who was when Kevin Gaines got killed? Who lost? Okay, and if you can answer that with that question, I can think of one person in particular that would have been hurt by Kevin Gaines not being around anymore. And I also think that that person could have very easily communicated to Ray Perez, as we know, still hung out at Death Row Things, was still in contact with Death Row. I don't think it would be difficult to make the association that he may have been asked to do what he did, to get back at Liga, because there's no tangential relationship between Liga and Gaines, especially, but between Gaines and Perez. Why would Perez be messing around with Frank Liga's stuff as a revenge for Kevin Gaines? That doesn't make any sense unless there's a much more direct relationship between Perez, Gaines, and Death Row Records.
Well, and it spins it off to another conversation, which we don't get. We could just hypothesize here. After the killing of Big and the potentiality of Puff being a target too, and they miss both of them, and David Mack having to go rob a bank to get more money to pay supposed shooter Amir Mohammed. Maybe this snatch of the dope was a potential fundraiser to raise more money for um, the assassin of Big, but that's obviously speculation. Maybe it
Sure.
was just more. Maybe it was just more fundraising. But
Yep. But that's
in
how that all. That's what Russ was at. The Russ was the spearhead of all of that, and it's oftentimes as the first mover, they call it, the first person, the tip of the spear, the front line. Whatever analogy you want to give
yeah,
for it. Those are the guys that are mowed down first. I mean, Russ was kind of like, in my mind, he was like that scene in Saving Private Ryan where they storm the beaches in Normandy and the first guys out are just massacred. They just
right.
they hit the beach, they're killed immediately because they're the first ones there. They're the immediate front line. Russ was no different. Russ, later cops came in, Phil Carson, other people came in later with some of the same beliefs and some of the same evidence and some of the same information, and were treated a little bit more credibly than Russ. But Russ was slaughtered. I mean, he was just like those guys on the beach, just bam, bam, bam,
Yeah.
bam, 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 he was done. And they really tried to mess around with his word and his legacy, and I just felt like that story needed to be corrected in the documentary.
I'm glad you did, man. That's part of what makes, again, I just got, no Diddy. I mean, I fell in love with Russell when I first met him because it's just like, I mean, we just need more cats like that. You could tell he's had much integrity, a great cop, great investigator. And he just, like, from the dead body to, the court hearing and to I mean, like Russell's widow said, he even stayed in contact with the families. I don't know. He's just a great guy, man.
Yeah,
And,
he was Russ had there's a story about Russ that nobody talks about, and that's the Ennis Cosby story.
mm,
And Ennis Cosby was the son of Bill Cosby, the comedian that fell into bad grace later. But at one point in time, Bill Cosby was one of the most popular people in the world. And Bill Cosby, huge comedian, on his own TV show and all that. His son Ennis Cosby was killed in a gang related shooting. They don't know why. It looked like he had a flat tire. He got pulled over and somebody rolled up on him and shot him to death. And that would be a huge loss for especially a celebrity like Bill Cosby and all that. But Russ, I mean, there were several leads that come in. Leads were flowing in. Russ was the one that followed every single lead that came in, no matter how crazy it was. He followed it up, and he took a lead that nobody else on the LAPD, none of the other investigators, considered credible in the least. And the lead was that the gun, after they shot him, they threw the gun into the LA River. And anybody that doesn't know about the LA River, it's a big cement construct, but the LA River runs through the entirety of Los Angeles. It's used for flood control. It's about a football field wide, if that gives you any indication of how wide the LA River is. It's about a football field wide and it runs for miles. And sometimes there's water in it, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's trees that grow in it. It's that crazy. But in this particular case, to give you an idea how big it was, somebody said that they threw the gun in the LA River. And everybody, oh, that's ridiculous. Oh, that's crazy. And nobody would want to do that. Russ went to the Los Angeles Police Academy and basically deputized 25, 30 recruits, cadets, what they call them then, cadets from the police academy and said, he commandeered them, you're coming with me. He had those guys drag the LA River, this football field 1 miles long. He had them walk a skirmish line like you see in TV shows where they have everybody all lined up with the dogs and they're going through and literally foot by foot pacing, walking down the body of this LA River to see if they could find anything. And you know what happened, Jeff? They found that weapon. And they found that weapon, and the weapon had prints on it, and the prints led back to a match. And they got the guy, they arrested the guy, and they convicted the guy of murder. All because
Wow.
Russ Poole took a crazy theory, commandeered the resources to do it, and brought a killer to justice. Okay.
I did not know that.
Yeah, true
Wow.
story. And that right there should be a movie all by itself. But Bill Cosby always, Russ would show me, notes from the family. Thank you so much for bringing justice to our son. But Russ was that guy. It didn't matter how crazy the
Wow.
theory was, and that leads to the Biggie thing. I mean, that in the Tupac thing, it's because Russ was never the guy to say no, that can't be possible. After you drag, I mean, you get a note like that, and you get a bunch of people, and you drag the LA River. I mean, to take a big thing like that, and then you find the weapon with a clue that everybody else was saying was too crazy. That's what I'm talking about. The contrast between a guy who's lazy, takes a 20-year-old narrative and tries to make the picture fit the frame, versus
Right.
a guy who says, I don't care how batshit crazy the theory is, I'm going to chase it down because you never freaking know. That
Yeah,
goes
man.
off to people still ask me about the patents. People still ask me about Little Half Dead, some of the theories that we talked about in Battle for Compton. Are those still possible? Are those still theories? Are you still working those? And I said, you know what? We laid out what we can about it until somebody else says otherwise. Kevin Gaines could be a suspect in the shooting. Little Half Dead could be. Patents could be. Until somebody says otherwise, it's still out there and it hasn't been
Right.
disproven. And that's the point that I think is laziness on the part of Greg Kading, is that he never actually proved that the anything other than what he wanted you to believe was the truth, that anything else didn't make any sense. He'd try to poo-poo it and he'd say, oh, it's all been debunked, and you like to hear that word a lot,
Yeah.
debunked. And he'd do that, but at the end of the day, what it would come down to was he just didn't want to believe it.
Well,
And
like you said, he had his own confirmation bias for whatever reason, who he's
absolutely.
protecting or whatever. Yeah, he had his
Yeah,
own
well,
little.
it's because if it's the Pattons or if it's Little Half Dead or if it's Kevin Gaines, you can't write a book and
Right.
make money off of a new novel story that is actually really an old story but with a new coat of paint. You can't do that. And yet, when you see the Fox special with Little Half Dead, he lies about where he was, and he lies about stories regarding Snoop and Tupac. I mean, he's telling lies on national television. You think to yourself, why the hell would you be doing this? Why would you be lying on national television about things? If you're supposed to be this, they offered him an opportunity to present his side of the story, and he's lying, openly, provably lying about things. And so you got that. Then you have the patents. And we caught the patents lying. We had a lie detector expert come in.
I have
Deceptive.
not heard of this name. Who are the patents?
Well, the patents were in Battle for Compton. We explored a theory that was given to us by Chris Blatchford of Fox TV. Fox T. He was a big investigative reporter for Fox TV. Is still extremely well regarded in the community. He had a letter that he had received as a lead early on in like '98, and this letter was supposed to be a confession letter that identified an alternative theory about who might have been responsible for the murder of Tupac Shakur. And we were with our attorney, Sandy Rivera, at the time when we were at Fox talking with Chris, and he said, "Hey, I never got a chance to follow up on this. Take a look at this letter." And I looked at it for a minute, and the first thing, long story short, was the first thing that jumped out at me in the letter was that Reggie Wright was in the letter spelled out by name. And so immediately I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't some random letter. This is somebody that knows something about what's going on at death row because, and I said, well, who wrote this letter? It says, well, it came to me through an informant, but it's supposed to be these two gang guys, Danny Patton, Malcolm Patton. Danny Patton was mentioned in Tim Brennan's affidavit, his search warrant, when they did the big gang sweep in Compton. Danny Patton's name, White Boy was his moniker, was mentioned in the Tim Brennan affidavit. And so you start to suddenly realize, wait a minute, there's more meat on this bone than you could possibly know because you're tying in all of these factoids into some random letter that's sitting in front of you saying that this is the story behind why Tupac got killed and who did it. And so there were three people mentioned. The Pattons were mentioned, and then a rapper by the name of Little Half Dead, who
I've
was
heard that story, but
Snoop's
yeah,
cousin.
okay.
Yeah, Snoop's cousin. And again, when we put this out in Battle for Compton, that this is just another theory. But if you're going to believe or the Orlando Anderson theory, and you're going to believe that one guy's going to take one gun to a 25 member entourage all armed, and you think that's going to work out well for you, then you might as well believe anything. Okay, you might as well believe in the
Right.
tooth fairy because that it was explained to me, and Keith Davis Jr. was the one who said it. He said, "Think about this for a minute. Every one of death row guys, they weren't like Michael Moore or Frank Alexander, who are obligated to Reggie Wright to not carry their guns. And in fact, they say, one of the common things that the Buntry shot back to the Cadillac, clearly there were a bunch of guys in the death row entourage, and we're figuring probably 20, 25 cars. So what is that? 25 at least, 25, maybe 50 people that were in this death row entourage. And how many of those people were convicted felons that were carrying firearms? Okay. I'd suggest to you the number is probably pretty substantial because none of those guys had to listen to a damn thing Reggie Wright had to say about don't carry your guns. Okay. It was just the people at his employ. So when you look at,
Homeboy security.
yeah, homeboy security. That's right. But when you think about it, I mean, this is how stupid this narrative is on its face that Keefe D said it and somebody else said it before. And the big thing about, well, Keefe D went to go get the murder weapon from Zip and Zip Martin, who's a drug dealer out of New York that happened to be in Vegas that day for some reason. And he went there and got a gun out of the pop-up compartment in the car. And he got that one gun. And then they went out looking for Suge Knight and Tupac, according to Keefe D. Well, wait a minute. So yeah, let's talk about the gang wisdom here for a minute, Jeff. Shall we explore that for a second?
Yes, let's please do.
The gang wisdom says, "Oh, I know that I'm going to go look for the most powerful man in the music industry, which would be Suge Knight at that time, one of the most popular rap artists of all time, Tupac, and I'm going to go look for them, knowing that they're surrounded by an entourage of 25 to 50 people, most of them armed." And I'm going to go and do that with a single gun.
Yeah, and
Genius
me being a
plan.
gang boss from LA is gonna get a gun from a guy from New York.
Well, yeah, and even if he did, you're bringing. It's like what do they say? You're bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Right, right.
You're bringing one gun. How many shots are you going to get off? They had the element of surprise, but the reality of it is that they said that they were actually actively stalking. They went to Club 662 looking for Suge Knight. Well, what if they had found him? They'd have found the other 25 guys with guns. Okay. So the idea that you would premeditatively, I don't care how mad you are at the situation, that you'd premeditatively get one gun to take on arguably 25 people or more. And by the way, if they were Club 662, you had a bunch of like 10 to 15 Vegas Metro guys there. Reggie
Yeah.
was there. He was armed. So then Michael Moore was armed. You're going to go to Club 662 and you're going to go look for them. And then what? You're just going to wave at them? Because you sure as hell ain't going to take one gun to 50 people that are armed because they're going to shoot back at your ass.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. I mean, that's the whole thing about it. You just when you tear these elements down, a simple argument is just like, well, that makes zero sense. And how stupid would you be if that's really, what you did? I think if you look at the investigation of Greg Kading and the investigation of Russell Poole, the contrast couldn't be greater. On the one hand, you've got a detective that knows nothing about any of this, being thrown into this big world of death row and securities, working for felons and gangsters and gangster rap, and a guy who's clearly, not in his element, but still trying to do the right thing and get to the bottom of, who killed who. And then on the other side of it, you've got a detective who's never been a homicide investigator, was always a drug investigator, never investigated a homicide, who picks a theory before he's ever looked at any of the other ones, rolls with it, tries to make the picture fit the frame, and I think we've seen over the last 10 years or so that it falls apart under its own weight. And I think that's what gives me pause as we move into the trial of Keith Davis for what he has claimed that he did. That I think it's going to be a very uphill battle for the prosecution if Keith Davis can actually make a good defense and make the case more about Greg Kading, more about that proffer deal, more about, the interview that he did in 2009 with Vegas PD, where we think, largely he was coerced by Darren Dupree and Wayne Higgins, his attorney. I think if you look at all of that, I think he has a chance of, if he makes it a referendum about Greg Kading and not a referendum about Keith Davis. So I think that would be the best. And I think that's how we kind of end the episode, is to ask that question, show these two different cops, and say, which one would you rather have working your case?
Well, and absolutely. And as the pressure mounts, Russell Poole at the end of this episode, he just can't take anymore. He lets his wife know, I can't. A year and a half away from retiring in his pension, he quits the LAPD, and we will pick up episode 5. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Stay tuned. Just getting started.